The Battle of Thermopylae, the most iconic last stand in the history of humanity. We've seen the film, The 300, we know the story, the 300 Spartans standing up to hundreds of thousands of Persians. But we've seen this story from the point of view of the spectator. We've seen it from the outside. How would it feel to actually be in that battle? How did the average Spartan soldier feel? What did it take for him to stand up to the enemy, to stand up to certain death? And this is what Steven Pressfield is trying to do in his novel Gates of Fire. He follows a Spartan from a young age, from the agoghi, from the training, to eventually reaching the point where he fights in Thermopylae. Now, Gates of Fire is historic fiction, so it's not a work of history, it's history mixed with fiction. And yet, it's the best insight I've read on the character building process of the Spartans. Now, Steven Pressfield is someone who has studied the warrior cultures, and he claims that these are important lessons because today, in the 21st century, even though most of us hopefully will never see battle, but in some ways we fight the same enemies as the Spartans fought. And this is not the Persians, these are the internal enemies of fear, of fatigue, of despair, of dark prospects. And Pressfield tries to see what lessons we can draw from the best warriors in history. What are the lessons we can draw today? So here are 3 lessons that we can take from the Spartans. The book Gates of Fire is first and foremost a study in fear. The main question that Pressfield asks through the protagonists of the book is, how do you deal with the fear of battle? How do you become accustomed to this fear? And the point he wants to make very clear is that every single Spartan experienced fear before battle. Whether this was a battle against an inferior enemy, a battle where the Spartans were almost certain they would win. Even before such a battle, because there would be losses, the hands tremble. The hands of these hardened soldiers actually shake. And in perhaps the most iconic, the most memorable scene of the book, we are in one of the last nights in Thermopylae. And there are some Spartans who actually try to escape because they know there's certain death. And they are arrested, and Spartan soldiers, the rest of the soldiers are furious. They actually want to kill them on the spot. And there's a very brave Spartan officer who says, first of all, don't kill them, let them go. And then he addresses his soldiers and he says, let's be honest, every single one of us has actually thought the same thing, that I want to live. Even Leonidas, even the king, actually last night, when he was turning and turning, of course, no one could sleep under such stress with the anticipation of another day of battle that could be the last. Even Leonidas had thought, this thought has crossed his mind, that I want to live. But they didn't go. So the point for the Spartan was to learn how to live with fear, rather than how to be fearless. So the point is, how do you manage fear? And this is what Spartans called phobologia, the study of fear. Pressfield explains that for the Spartan, it is important to understand that the fear begins somewhere in our soul, but it expresses itself through the body. So the first thing that the Spartans would try to do is to make sure that they control the places in their body where fear expresses itself. Similar to what today we would call meditation, trying to concentrate and relax different parts of their body, particularly on their face, control different muscles and make sure they're as relaxed as possible. Another thing they try to do is control their breath. Pressfield explains how before the point of attack, the Spartans would sing. And at the peak of this song, the spears would go from vertical to horizontal, which was the last message that we are attacking. And he explains that this played 2 functions. The one was the intimidation factor. So the enemies, imagine now, you see this wave of shields and the shields are shining. You can't really see in their eyes because they wear their helmets. It's like you see the devil coming after you. So this was very, very intimidating for the opponents. But Pressfield said that singing had also a different function, which was to open your chest, and through breathing and through exhale, you control your breath, and this mitigates somehow the stress that the Spartan felt just in the last moment before the first contact with the enemy. Now, another important element of fear is what Nietzsche would call, what is your why? Why do you do all these things? And with Spartans, beyond the fear of death, there was an even bigger fear. And this was the fear of dishonoring Sparta, dishonoring themselves, dishonoring their honor, being embarrassed to their comrades, being embarrassed to their families. But there was a bigger fear. Now, someone could say this is motivation by fear. You're not motivated by something positive. You motivate because you want to avoid something negative. And I understand that. In this respect, I would prefer the Athenians, who seem to be more motivated by a positive. If you read the famous funeral speech by Pericles, he makes actually this point, that they're motivated by positive values, that they're having a good life, and therefore when this life is threatened, they defend it. Whereas with the Spartans, our whole life is an endless preparation for the worst, and when the worst comes, we have to stand up to it. But here's the point. You don't have to adopt the values of the Spartans to understand that the way they mitigated fear, or the way they would prepare for the challenges, which is the next two tips, are actually quite useful. So these are tips that you can appreciate even if you don't appreciate the Spartan society. The rule of training for Spartans was simple. Make your training so challenging that the war, the actual war, looks like a relief. A training regime for the Spartans was the 8-nighter. So, you know, the Hell Week in the Special Forces, where you spend 5 days without sleep. So the Spartans had this every single year in the training, and it lasted actually 8 days. They would operate during the night, and they would quote unquote rest during the day. Now, why did they train during the night? The way the war was taking place back then, which is through the collision of one phalanx, one line of soldiers versus another line of soldiers, this would create chaos. It would create a lot of dust, and your vision would be very narrow. So training in the dark means that you can execute these maneuvers in the most difficult conditions. So again, we see the principle. Make it's so challenging and realistic that then the battle itself doesn't seem such a difficult challenge. And this was, of course, the difference of the professional soldier of the Spartan versus the soldiers, the citizen soldiers of other cities whose training was way more basic. Now, and of course, you've heard about the agogi actually in Greece, which is the training of the youngsters. And this was also very, very challenging. Stephen Pressfield takes us through an evening, a night, an endless night of that training, where one of the trainers is pissed off because one kid made a mistake. It had its shield sitting on the wrong way, and in a way that potentially in a war someone could grab it and you wouldn't have time to defend the shield. And for this, he punishes the whole regiment. And the punishment is, throughout the night, they would have a shield drill, where they push with every line pushes the front line, which is like the front line of the battle. And he describes it in very, very vivid colors. He explains how many kids would break their nose because you push with your head the shield. He would explain how they would lose their bodily functions. And here's the part that made the biggest impression on me. At some point it says, and every single kid knew that this was a night, but the next day would still be a day full of drill, a day full of training. So there's not even the hope that at the end of this night, at least we will rest. It is, we suffer immensely now, and we're going to suffer also tomorrow. And again, realistically, in most of the cases, most of the wars that the Spartans would have to face, they would not be so challenging as having to go through these ordeals or, for example, 8 nights without rest. Or allegedly, supposedly, at the last couple of days of the training, they were not allowed any water or any liquid. Now, is this even physically possible? I'm not sure, but again, you get the main point. They go through these difficult things, and they go through these difficult things all together. So this is why a soldier or an officer would trust with his life and give his life for King Leonidas, because they've been together through all these challenges. And here's one thing about Sparta. Particularly if someone is familiar with the philosophical ideas that I find inspiring, the ideas of objectivism, the ideas of freedom, one could say, it looks like now you are glorifying people who were mindless brutes or who were mindless killing machines. But it's a bit more nuanced than that. Because remember, Sparta was a city literally without walls. Most of the Spartans had chosen this lifestyle and these virtues voluntarily. Now, obviously, it would require a huge strength of character to say to a society of honor like Sparta was to tell them, okay, goodbye, I'm leaving. But the truth is that most of the people in the Spartan army consider these values as their chosen values. And maybe this idea that they fought for freedom in Thermopylae, in the hot gates against the Persians, maybe this is a projection that in retrospect we make. But there seems to be some evidence that this is also how they experienced it. They indeed thought that we are now fighting for our freedom. Therefore, I find their discipline and their focus on their training not necessarily as something that would make the Spartan society a model society, but indeed as something which we can draw important lessons. For example, we see these days athletes who try to train under the most difficult conditions. In his book, Tim Grover, in the book where he's talking about how he trained Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, he talks about how Kobe Bryant in one All-Star game broke his nose. And he actually insisted to train, to not miss many days of training, because he wanted to train and actually play with a concussion. Why? To test himself how his body would react playing with a head injury. Now, obviously, it's a very bad advice to have a head injury and say, okay, let's see what I do. Obviously, he had medical supervision and all that stuff. But the message is he tried to train in the most difficult and to actually play in the most difficult circumstances. And again, of course, you apply this at your own discretion to your life. Context matters here. We have different goals in life. We do different things. So for me, training in difficult conditions could mean that quite often my most important talks are in the summer. So I rehearse in the scorching heat of the afternoon, or I rehearse, real life rehearse. I walk out with AirPods and people think I'm talking to someone, but I'm actually rehearsing my talk. And once you do these rehearsals uphill or while it's very hot outside, on the actual day when you stand on a cool stage and you see people who are there to listen to you, this actually, it looks like a much more comfortable and I would say even pleasant experience. As the Spartans would put it, we spend tears now that we may conserve blood later. Stephen Pressfield talks about how the Spartans had as their goal to perform the commonplace under the most uncommonplace conditions. To perform the commonplace under uncommonplace conditions. And this means have these habits, these good routines that before the battle or before something important for the context of your life will give you some extra confidence of the familiar. It's not a coincidence that from the special corps in the army to high achieving teams, they all place attention to routines, doing the same things at the same time. Someone like Mike Phelps, for example, who had a very particular routine. He would arrive earlier in the swimming pool, and everything he did was the same every single time. The way he would put his earbuds, the way he would sit down, not in a way that his body would become lethargic, but also not to expand unnecessary energy. Or I've seen Giannis Antetokounmpo twice playing basketball live in a live game, and I have the habit of always arriving very early for games. I just like the pre-game rituals. And I find it very interesting. He's the first one to enter the arena 2 hours before the game. Why? To do his usual routine. He has his music, he does his shots, and on a game where I also saw Luka Doncic, I found it very interesting. He was also the first to enter the arena, and he followed what I presume was his usual routine. So routine, we talk about these little things that when you do them before an important occasion, they give you this confidence that you're doing something familiar, and that in the same way that you've done this a million times, you will do this again. The Spartans famously never asked how many are the enemies. They would just ask, where is the enemy? And what does this mean? It means that every battle for them, in essence, was the same battle. They thought, look, no matter whether we face like a random Greek city-state, which probably we're going to win, or we face the hundreds of thousands of the Persian army, we will do the same things before the battle. We will fall on the same routines. And what were the things that they had done a million times? Every morning before the battle, they would comb their hair, they would sign their shields, they would sign their helmet, they would do their sacrifices to their gods, and they would do some basic drills. Now, this has some practical value. For example, a shiny shield meant that, particularly if the sun would reflect on it, they would look more intimidating. But also the importance was that they would keep active. We see Leonidas actually wanting to make the case that everyone does something before the battle. No one sits idly, because if you sit down idly, this is when overthinking will take place. And of course, in front of a difficult battle, this is not what you want. So, as Pressfield says, for the Spartans, war is work. It's not a mystery. And work is based on these little routines. Before this, very important, you do something that you do every single day. You keep active, and again, this feels familiar. And the familiar gives you a small boost of confidence. And these routines, says Pressfield, they have to be physical routines, active routines. As opposed to what? As opposed to before battle to give them pep talks where you bang your chest and you have this rush of adrenaline for a few moments, but then it drops. Pressfield makes a case that it is a characteristic of the unprepared army, what he calls pseudo-andria, which means fake bravery, fake manliness. So Pressfield says, you will see that the Spartans are quiet before a battle, or they keep the tone down. Of course, they sing the songs, the paeans, as they attack, but again, this is part of the routine. And Leonidas, in his pep talks, is nothing like the movie when we see him screaming and all that stuff. He tells them a few things. You know why you're here. We are the front line of the defense of freedom from Persian despotism, and we're here to do what we've done our whole lives. Now, reading Glover's stories about the habits of Michael Jordan, we see that Jordan before games did not like all this bombastic shouting and the prep talks. A light fist bump with his teammates, and that was all. Again, because the biggest confidence booster is not these big words that will very soon fade away. It is the knowledge that you've done what you need to do, you've done it many times, and this is just another day in the office. And this is something that I don't like in the film 300, that it portrays the Spartans as, shouting and bumping their chest, whereas the Spartan actually, this was not their characteristic. Actually, according to Pressfield, this is something that they considered quite ridiculous when they saw it in other armies. Talking about routines, you will notice that many high achievers have the reputation that they're superstitious, particularly in sports. But when you think about it, maybe what other people consider superstitions is just faith and confidence in their routine. So for example, if you train in a particular way with a particular, let's say, stretch band, you want that stretch band on the day of the important game. So when I see people who others view as superstitious, I view people who just want to fall back on their habits, and actually I appreciate it. Of course, there's a dichotomy here. Quite often you will not be able to fall on your habits. Let's say in the army there's a very early morning attack, or you have to give a talk and you cannot go through your usual rehearsal routine. That's when you fall back on your good training, because if the routines at some point betray you, then your training is not going to betray you. Steven Pressfield understands something very important. Whether we deal with intellectual work, as he describes it, for example, in The War of Art, or whether we deal with actual war, and he has studied many cultures of warriors, it is the same virtues that one has to practice. Whether you are in Thermopylae or whether you are writing a symphony, you need to have the same virtues of character. So when it comes to some further reading on Steven Pressfield, my favorite book is Turning Pro. I've done a video, I will link to it at the end, with a deep dive on the book. And if you like historical fiction, I would recommend his book, The Lion's Gate. It's a book about the 6 Days War of Israel versus the Arabs in 1967. It's so well written, you can almost smell the fuel of the tanks as if you are in the first line of the battle. So to sum up, the 3 lessons that we can learn from Spartans, even if we never fight an actual war in our life, is first, realize that fear is going to be there, and the point is, how do you manage it? How do you turn it from an enemy to a tool, to a motivator? Number 2, practice in a way that makes the actual event seem relatively easy compared to your practice. And third, have good habits, good routines that can give you a boost of confidence when it really counts. Hope you found value in this video. See you in the next one.